While loops. In this video, we will learn how to execute statements repeatedly. Consider the following program. Suppose I want to write a program that asks the user to enter a password, and if he enters the incorrect password, it'll say try again, and if the user enters the correct password, then the program will proceed on to the next step. The program starts like this. It starts by declaring a variable named password that'll store the actual correct password. Then in the next line, it'll use the input command to ask the user to enter the password. It'll then wait for the user to type a response, then press enter, and then the user's response will then get stored in the user_guess variable. So let's say, for example, the user types the word boogie, then presses enter. That string will then get stored inside the user_guess variable. Then in the next line, a variable named guesses is declared and set equal to 1, which will be used to keep track of the number of guesses that it takes for the user to guess the correct password. Then in the next line, we start our if statement, where the condition states if the user guess is not equal to the password, or in other words, if the user typed in an incorrect guess, then we'll execute the corresponding body of statements belonging to that if statement, beginning with another input command that'll say try again, and then wait for the user to enter another value. And then when it does, it'll store that value back inside the user_guess variable. So let's say this time the user types boogaloo23, then presses enter. That value then gets stored inside the user_guess variable. Guesses gets increased by 1, then that completes the if statement. The program then moves on to the next statement. Now, without me executing this, you can probably already see the flaw in this program. The upside is that if the user enters the correct password the first time, then the program will work just fine. If the user enters the correct password the second time, then the program will work just fine. However, what if the user enters the incorrect password again the second time? Well, as you can see here, it just moves on to the next step regardless, as if it entered the correct value. How can we correct this? Well, one way would be to add another if statement, so that if the user enters the incorrect password a second time, it'll be told to try again once more. But what if the user enters the wrong password a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time? Okay? The reality is, we don't know how many guesses it'll take for the user to enter the correct password. So rather than write a program that has an exact number of if statements, what we need is a program that'll execute the input command as many times as we need until the correct password gets entered. Or in other words, what we need is a while loop. Okay? A while loop is a body of statements that executes repeatedly until the looping condition becomes false. To do this in my program, all I did was replace the word if with the word while. So now, instead of the program saying if true, then execute, the program now states while true, execute. Or in other words, continue executing until the condition is no longer true. This also introduces the final kind of statement that we're going to learn about in this course. In earlier videos, we've learned about the sequential statement, which executes one time in the order that it's written. We learned about the conditional statement, which executes when a condition is true. And then here in this video, we're going to learn about the iterative statement, which is a type of conditional statement that gets executed repeatedly until its condition becomes false. So let's take our Python interpreter and execute this program. So we start by declaring the variable password that'll store the correct password. We then invoke the input command that'll ask the user to enter a password, wait for a response, then store it inside the user_guess variable. So let's say the user types the word bunny, that'll get stored in the variable. Then in the next line, we declare the guesses variable that'll keep track of the number of guesses. Then in the next line, the Python interpreter reaches a while loop. So when the interpreter reaches the while loop, the first thing it'll do is evaluate the condition. If it's true, then it'll execute the body of statements belonging to the while loop. Notice that both of these statements are indented one level. This is required, otherwise the Python interpreter will not interpret these statements as belonging to the while loop. So let's go to the first statement. The first statement in the loop says to output try again, and then wait for the user to type a response. And once the user does and presses enter, the response will get stored inside the user_guess variable. Now let's say the user types bunny at 123. We then move on to the next line, the guesses variable gets increased by 1. That completes the body of the while loop, so we return to the condition. We evaluate it. We see that the user guess is still not equal to password, so the condition is still true, so we return to the body. We invoke the input command again, which says try again, wait for a response. Let's say the user types boogaloo at 23. That value gets stored inside the user underscore guess variable. Then we increase guesses by 1. Then we return to the condition. We evaluate and we see that it's still true. The user guess is still not equal to the password. So we come back into the while loop, invoke the input command, which says try again. It waits for a response. The user then types in the correct value. However, we're not done. The condition does not get checked until we complete the entire loop, the entire body of statements. So even though we can see that the correct password was entered, we still need to go on to the next statement, which increases the guesses variable by 1, execute it, then evaluate the condition. Now the condition is false because now the user guess is equal to the password. Since the condition is false, the body of the while loop gets skipped. We move on to the next statement, which simply prints out correct. Number of guesses is plus the number stored inside the guesses variable. So, in summary, a while loop is similar to an if statement in that it checks a condition, and if the condition is true, it'll execute a body of statements. However, whereas an if statement will execute that body one time, then move on, a while loop will repeatedly execute that body of statements until the condition becomes false. I'll close this video by discussing a common error that programmers make when working with while loops. This line specifically is the most significant line in the while loop, partially because it updates the user underscore guess variable. Suppose I didn't update it. Suppose I simply invoked the input method without changing the user underscore guess variable. Well, the problem with that is that even if the user enters the correct password, it won't matter because the user underscore guess variable doesn't change. It's still the same incorrect value. So the user could type the correct password 1,000,000 times and it won't matter because the condition will continue to be true. The user underscore guess variable will continue to be the same exact value, and thus the condition of the while loop will never change, resulting in an infinite loop. An infinite loop is a loop that goes on forever since the condition never evaluates to false. So the moral of the story is that whenever you're working with the while loop, make sure that you're updating the variable that controls the condition so that eventually the condition can become false. If the controlling variable never gets updated, never gets changed, then the condition will always be true, and thus the loop will go on forever and ever.